The morning after the murders, he took a selfie. He was standing in front of a shower. His thumb was up. He was smiling. The photograph was introduced as evidence in March 2025, and it became one of the most discussed pieces of the case for a specific reason. Dylan Mortensen, one of the two surviving roommates who had been inside the house on the night of November 13, 2022, had told investigators she had seen a man in a mask standing in the hallway. She described him. She said he had bushy eyebrows. The selfie, taken the morning after 4 of her friends had been stabbed to death in the rooms around her, showed a man whose appearance matched that description precisely. His eyebrows, his face, a thumbs up. The morning after. Bryan Kohberger was 28 years old at the time of the murders. He was a Ph.D. student in criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, a 10-minute drive from Moscow, Idaho. He was not studying how to commit crimes. He was studying how crimes are investigated, solved, and prevented. He was studying the behavioral patterns of violent offenders, what motivates them, how they select targets, how they evade detection, what mistakes they make. He was learning the frameworks that investigators use to build cases, identify suspects, and understand the psychology of people who do catastrophic harm to strangers. He had previously worked as a corrections officer in Pennsylvania before pursuing his graduate degree. He had been accepted into one of the programs in the country specifically designed to produce the kind of person who sits across from a killer in an interrogation room and knows what to ask and what to look for and what the evidence means. On July 2, 2025, he sat on the other side of that equation. On July 2, 2025, Bryan Kohberger stood in the Ada County Courthouse in Boise, Idaho. Judge Stephen Hippler asked him, one by one, whether he had killed each of the 4 victims willingly, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice aforethought. For each name, Kohberger said yes. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. Yes, 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 yes. The trial that had been scheduled to begin weeks later was canceled. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. On July 23, 2025, Judge Hippler sentenced Bryan Kohberger to 4 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the burglary charge. When given the opportunity to speak at his sentencing, Kohberger declined. "I respectfully decline," he said. Those were the only words he offered. No explanation, no apology, no statement to the families sitting in that courtroom who had spent nearly 3 years waiting for an answer to a question he still has not fully answered. Why? The house at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, was a 6-bedroom rental home shared by 6 students. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen had been best friends since childhood. They had grown up together, gone to the same schools, and ended up at the same university. They were inseparable in the way that some friendships become something closer to family. Kaylee was 21. Madison was 21. Zana Kernodle was 20 and had been dating Ethan Chapin, who was also 20 and a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity at the university. The 4 of them had spent the evening of November 12th out together, at a food truck, at a bar, living the kind of ordinary college Saturday night that millions of students live every weekend across the country. They came home. They went to bed. 2 other roommates, Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen, were also in the house that night. All 6 people in that house went to sleep. Only 2 of them woke up. The murders happened in the early hours of November 13, 2022. The first 911 call did not come until nearly noon. Surviving roommates and visiting friends had initially believed Mogen and Goncalves were simply asleep. When they could not wake them, they called 911. When officers arrived, they found 4 people who had been stabbed to death with a large fixed-blade knife. The medical examiner later determined that some of the victims had defensive wounds. Some had high levels of alcohol in their system and may not have fully regained consciousness before being attacked. The investigation that followed was one of the largest in Idaho history. Moscow is a small college town. The University of Idaho has approximately 12,000 students. The murders happened in an off-campus house in a neighborhood where students live and walk and gather at all hours. There were no immediate suspects. There was no clear motive. There were no witnesses who had seen anything definitive that first morning. What investigators had was a crime scene, 4 bodies, and a community that had been shaken to its foundation. Parents were calling their children at the university. Students were asking whether it was safe to stay. The university held town halls. Law enforcement held press conferences. And for weeks, the investigators had nothing they could give the public that resembled an answer. No name, no description that led anywhere. No clear picture of what had happened in that house between the time the last victim came home and the time the first 911 call was made, nearly 12 hours later. This is the case ledger. If this is your first time here, we follow evidence. We don't protect powerful people. We don't move on until the case moves. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what comes next in this one. The investigation took weeks to produce a suspect. During those weeks, investigators worked through thousands of tips, reviewed surveillance footage from across the area, and focused on a white Hyundai Elantra that had been captured on camera near the house in the early morning hours of November 13th. The car was a critical lead. It appeared on multiple cameras in the area. It was in the vicinity of the house. Finding it meant finding whoever had been inside it. Cell tower data and surveillance footage began to narrow the field. Bryan Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra was identified. His phone placed him in the area. Records showed his device had pinged cell towers near the King Roadhouse, not just on the night of November 13th, but on multiple prior occasions. 12 visits to the area over the months before the murders. 12 times. A criminology student studying at the university across the state line, driving to a house in Moscow, Idaho, more than 10 times before the night he entered it. The prosecution would later describe this as surveillance, a methodical approach to a target, someone who had studied the location, learned the rhythms of the neighborhood, understood the layout of the street before he ever went inside. The same analytical framework he was being taught to apply to the behavior of violent offenders, applied, according to prosecutors, to the planning of his own crime. He was not impulsive. He was not chaotic. He was, the evidence suggested, exactly the kind of person his academic program was designed to study. When investigators searched Kohberger's apartment in Pullman, Washington, they found something that connected him to the crime scene in a way that required no interpretation. A knife sheath had been left behind near Madison Mogen's body. On that sheath, investigators found DNA, a male profile. They compared it to a DNA sample obtained from Kohberger's father. The comparison established that the DNA on the sheath belonged to someone in the Kohberger family. When Kohberger's own DNA was later obtained and tested, it matched the profile on the sheath. The statistical probability of a coincidental match was stated in numbers too large to represent as anything other than certainty for practical purposes. He had been inside that house. He had been near that body. He had left something behind. Kohberger was arrested on December 30th, 2022, at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He had driven cross-country after the murders, a journey of nearly 2,500 miles from Pullman, Washington, to a small town in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, returning home for the holiday break. When Pennsylvania State Police and the FBI arrived at the house, Kohberger's car was parked outside. The car that investigators had been looking for across thousands of hours of surveillance footage. The one on the cameras near the house on King Road. It was sitting in a driveway in Pennsylvania, and the man who had been driving it was inside with his family. He was taken into custody without incident. His apartment in Pullman was searched. His car was searched. A subsequent search of his car found it had been meticulously cleaned, an observation the prosecution would later use at the sentencing hearing to describe a person who had understood the forensic implications of what he had done and had attempted to address them. He was extradited to Idaho in January 2023, transported on a commercial flight, and appeared in a Moscow, Idaho courtroom wearing a jail uniform and saying nothing. The legal process that followed was lengthy. At his arraignment in May 2023, Kohberger remained silent while a judge entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. He subsequently waived his right to a speedy trial. The case moved through pretrial motions over the next 2 years, and the defense sought to suppress the DNA evidence, the cell phone data, and other evidence obtained during the investigation. A judge denied those motions. The case was transferred from Lata County, where Moscow is located, to Ada County, more than 300 miles away, after the defense argued that Kohberger could not receive a fair trial in the county where the murders had occurred. The trial was scheduled to begin August 11, 2025. It never happened. On June 30, 2025, Kohberger accepted a plea deal. 2 days later, he stood before the judge and said yes 4 times. His father was in the gallery. The families of the victims were in the gallery. Kaylee Goncalves' father, Steve, had publicly reacted to the thumbs-up selfie months earlier, calling it something he could not put words to in public. He and the other victim families had been preparing for a trial. They had been told for nearly 3 years that there would be a trial, that they would sit in a courtroom and watch the evidence presented and watch the man who had killed their children face the full weight of what the state of Idaho could bring to bear against him. The plea deal removed that. It also removed the possibility of a death sentence. The families were not unanimous in how they responded. Some accepted it, some could not. The Goncalves family and the Kernodle family publicly expressed that the deal had been made without adequate consideration of what they had needed from this process. The prosecution explained that an accepted plea agreement could not ethically be reopened once the defendant had agreed to its terms. The families were left with the outcome that had been negotiated on their behalf, whether they would have chosen it or not. At the sentencing on July 23, 2025, the families and surviving roommates were given the opportunity to speak. Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen both submitted statements. Mortensen had been the one who saw a man in the hallway that night, masked with bushy eyebrows, standing in a house where 4 of her closest friends were already dead or dying. She had gone back to her room. She had locked the door. She had stayed there. She had survived. In her statement, she described what the years since November 13, 2022 had looked like from the inside. The anxiety, the intrusive memories, the specific weight of being the person who was there and came out the other side when others did not. She asked why she had lived when the others had not. It is a question nobody in that courtroom could answer for her. A sister of one of the victims called Kohberger a sociopath, a psychopath, a murderer. She said it directly and without hesitation, looking at the man who had ended her sister's life. Kohberger sat at the defense table and did not react. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He sat with the stillness of someone who had decided, before he walked into that room, that he was not going to give the families anything they could read as emotion or remorse or acknowledgement of what they had lost. Kohberger was given the opportunity to speak at his sentencing. He stood. He said 3 words. I respectfully decline." And then he sat back down. The families had come hoping for something, an acknowledgement, an explanation, a single sentence that might begin to make sense of why their children had been taken by a stranger on a November night. They did not receive it. 4 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. A man who studied the science of violent crime, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. The prosecutor, who presented the evidence at the sentencing hearing, laid out, for the first time publicly, the specific order in which the 4 victims were killed in those early morning hours. The sequence of a crime that had been planned across multiple visits to a house in a town where the killer had no obvious connection to anyone inside it. The motive has never been officially established. No one knows, from any statement Kohberger has made, why he chose that house or those 4 people. The prosecutor confirmed there was no evidence of a prior relationship between Kohberger and any of the victims. Latah County Prosecutor Bill Thompson said there was no evidence Kohberger had a background of violence or a criminal history before the night of November 13, 2022. He had arrived at WSU that fall as a new PhD student. He had been there for months, and then, on a November night, he drove to a house 10 minutes away and killed 4 people who did not know him. Moscow Police Chief James Fry said after the sentencing that new information could still emerge as documents in the case are unsealed. He said that in cases like this, people sometimes come forward years later with things they had been holding. He said, "You will definitely find out some more stuff." The case has a resolution. 4 guilty pleas. 4 consecutive life sentences. A man who will die in prison for what he did in the early morning hours of November 13, 2022. The physical evidence, the DNA on the knife sheath, the cell tower data, the 12 prior visits, the meticulously cleaned car, was summarized by the prosecutor at the sentencing hearing. It was the closest thing to a trial that this case ever had. What it does not have is the thing the families asked for at the sentencing and did not receive: an explanation, a reason, anything that might begin to answer the question of why those 4 people were chosen on that specific night. Kohberger sat in that courtroom and declined to speak. The families sat in that courtroom and asked why. The judge sentenced him, and the case ended. And the question that has been at the center of this case since the first 911 call: why those 4 people? Why that house? Why any of it remains exactly where it has always been, unanswered. Now tell us in the comments, does a plea deal that removes the death penalty feel like justice to you in a case like this? The families were divided. The public was divided. We want to know where you stand.